us today. I hope this is going to be part of an ongoing lecture series. We've already got better attendance in our Powdermill series of Powdermill, so hey, fantastic. So this talk is about bugs, even though you maybe can't tell that from the starting slide here. And I'm going to talk about some weird plants and the bugs who love them. So I'm a beetle scientist. I study insects and I specialize in beetles. I've discovered new species of beetles in the mountains of Australia and the forests of Chile. I've blasted iridescent weevils with subatomic particles from a synchrotron to try to figure out how they make their iridescent colors. I studied the taxonomy and evolution of these cool, beautiful little brown fungus beetles. But I was asked to come here and talk to you guys about the research that I'm doing at Powdermill. So to talk about my research at Powdermill, we got to take a step back and ask, what is a flower? What is a flower? Take a moment, picture a flower in your minds. You might think of something like this. This is almost exactly what I would draw if someone said draw a flower. It has a little pollen-bearing region in the middle. It's symmetrical, it's pretty, it's got lovely little petals. It's visited by adorable, friendly little pollinators like bees and butterflies. We love our pollinators. It smells really nice. Everyone reminds you in life to stop and smell the flowers. You might even have pollinator habitat in your own yard. You might be planting extra flowers in your yard and putting up a little sign like this that says, we love our pollinators. And there's a good reason for that, because you can't have those flowers and those pollinators without each other. A lot of flowers actually have really tight relationships with their pollinators. For example, you've got orchid bees here. These bees pollinate flowers that have this very elaborate little spring mechanism where the bee climbs in to retrieve the scented waxes and oils it wants from that flower, and a little spring comes down and goes blorp and glues a little packet of pollen onto the back of the bee. It can only do that with one species of bee. You also have these guys called bee orchids. This is a flower. This is the wasp that pollinates it. This is the flower. This is the bee that pollinates it. This is a weird thing that plants do called sexual mimicry. This is where the plant wants to look exactly like the female of these different insects. So when the male comes along and tries to mate with the flower, it's actually pollinating the plant. Very weird stuff. Well, that's a whole other school of research. It's really fascinating. But there's these really tight relationships between flowering plants and their pollinators. There's even this wonderful orchid. We have a specimen of this back at the museum. This is called Araceae sesquipedale. It is an orchid that has a nectar tube that is so long, it's going out of frame here. The nectar tube is coming all the way back here, and it can only be pollinated by one species of moth. That's the only moth in the world that has a proboscis that's as long as that nectar tube. So you get these really tight, interesting coevolutionary relationships. So flowers have specialized pollinators. Flowers are pretty, smell nice. We like to look at them and have them around. Our next question is, what is an aroid flower? Are there any gardeners or plant people, botanists at all in this room? Yeah, all right, we got at least one. Excellent. Yeah, the master gardeners will be all over this. But aroid plants, also called arums, are a weird lineage of plants, and I want to talk about their flowers. Aroid flowers don't look like flowers. They look like a weird alien that's busting up out of the ground, or a suspicious poison thing that you might find in a video game, or a weird little trap that's designed to catch insects inside, like a jack-in-the-pulpit. They don't look like a flower. They don't look like a flower that anyone not on drugs would draw. Their shape is very weird. Instead of a little bit of pollen in the center and beautiful petals all around it, you have this nubbin called a spadix. I think the spadix of the skunk cabbage looks suspiciously like the novel coronavirus, but I'm sure that's just a coincidence. And it's enclosed in this big, weird, fleshy lobe called a spade. So the spade wraps around the spadix. And they don't tend to have close relationships with specialized pollinators, although occasionally they will do some coevolution. This is a giant pitcher plant, the genus Nepenthe, that has co-evolved with tree shrews to attract the tree shrew to lick the nectar off part of the floral structure and then poop inside the sort of pitcher part of the pitcher plant, which contributes much needed nitrogen to that plant. It needs nitrogen to grow, just like we all do. It lives in really bad rainforest soil and doesn't have a chance to get a lot from its roots, so it has to get its nitrogen from this guy's poop. And its solution was, you know what? We're just gonna make a little tasty treat in our little nectary. We're gonna attract this tree shrew and have the exact correct shaped pitcher for the tree shrew to sit on and poop into. Amazing, incredible co-evolution story. And finally, aroids don't smell very good. Do you guys know who this is? I'm assuming many of us have seen this plant before. This is skunk cabbage. These guys are out and blooming right now. They are so cool, but you can also tell when you're walking by a big stand of skunk cabbage because it has a very distinctive, stinky smell. It's not called great nice cabbage or lavender cabbage or violets cabbage. It's called skunk cabbage because it smells like skunks. That's not even the worst smelling aroid plant. You also have the Titan arum. You notice some tiny little people standing down here gazing up in awe and horror at this Titan arum bloom. The tasting notes for the Titan arum smell include cheese, garlic, sweaty socks, rotting fish, and feces. You also have this guy, the dead horse arum, which is a really incredible plant. It has what's been described as a strong putrid smell. In actual, honest to goodness scientific research, it was determined that flies that normally scavenge on dead carcasses and dead carrion cannot tell the difference between dead meat and this flower. And in case you don't believe me, here's some photos of the dead horse arum. Enjoy your popcorn while you gaze into the nasty, hot, stinky, furry hole at the center of the dead horse arum. There was, naturalists of a couple centuries ago suggested that it was actually trying to mimic the butt of a recently dead horse. Like other aroid plants, including our friend the skunk cabbage, it is thermogenic, so it makes heat. It creates warmth, and so it's stinky, it is radiating warmth, and it's really hairy. In fact, it has all of these little hairs that all point in. And the reason the hairs point in is because a fly lands on this big stinky flower and says, oh, this is great, I've got to check this out. And as it walks further in to the spade that's wrapped around the spadix down here, it's going to walk in here, and those little inward pointing hairs are going to trap the flies down here. And the flies are banging around. You can see there's some dead flies at the bottom of this one. The genus name means fly eating. Helicodicerus buskivorus. It's not really eating the flies, it's simply trapping them inside until they've banged around enough in there to actually pollinate the flower, and then the spade will wilt and the flies can come back out. So it's like you aren't coming out of your room until your homework is done. So that's the dead horse arum. That's one of the weirdest plants that I've ever encountered. I just wanted to share that with everybody. So the question that you might have at this point is, aroids, why are you like this? Why do you have to be like this? Why can't you be pretty and smell nice and act like a normal flower? And their answer is similar to the answer that you would get if you asked me, why can't you dress more pretty and wear perfume? I would say, I'm old and I don't have time for that. These guys are really old. This is a little diagram showing the lineages of fungi and plants, the number of species, and how they evolved through time. You can see our paleontological eras up here, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and then the Cenozoic up here. And we're talking about flowering plants. This includes both our aroids and all the other normal flowering plants. So your dicots, your more typical daisies and roses and typical flowery flowers, are the result of what some scientists call the angiosperm terrestrial revolution, because angiosperm people love sounding self-important. And basically what happened is about 66 to 70 million years ago, there was this huge explosion in diversity of lineages of angiosperm plants, of flowering plants. And a lot of that is attributed to coevolution with insect pollinators, with insect herbivores. Basically, if bugs want to eat the plants want the bugs to not eat them, but also to pollinate them, please. And so you have this sort of incredible explosion of biological innovation, and tons of species are rising. Really cool and exciting stuff. But aroids, our skunk cabbages and friends, they evolved way back here, 120 million years ago. There aren't any little pollinators flying around back then. These dicots, this incredible evolutionary radiation that happens up here, none of these little fuzzy bees and butterflies and moths have evolved yet. They don't exist. So if you're an aroid, if you're a little skunk cabbage or a dead horse lily, and you've evolved back here, none of these pollinators are available to you. What's available to you? What can you work with? Well, consider fungus beetles. Fungus beetles and flies, anything that feeds on fungus. Fungus has been diversifying on land since long before plants even had the idea to become vascular and have veins. So fungus has been diversifying on land since before there was algae on land. And so all of these insects, there's this huge diversity of really cool insects that are available to act as pollinators, but they're all feeding on fungus and rotting carrion and poop from what organisms would have been around in the Jurassic? Anyone?
Dinosaurs.
Dinosaur poop, that's right, dinosaur poop, dinosaur carcasses, rotting fungus, rotting wood, that's what the beetles and flies are feeding on. So these aroids need somebody to help pollinate them because they're plants, they can't walk around and do it themselves. So they can't rely on these. They have to turn to things like flies and beetles who love stinky, rotten stuff. They love poop, they love fungus, they love all kinds of gross carrion. And so that's why aroids are so weird. They don't need to have fancy colors or radial symmetry or weird UV signals to attract their pollinators. They just want to smell real stinky. They want to smell like, again, those delicious foods their pollinators love. And the heat that they can make, that thermogenic property that they have, helps to spread their delicious stink far and wide to attract more pollinators successfully. This is really neat. This is an Araceae. It's related to jack-in-the-pulpits. This is a Japanese species that actually mimics mushrooms. And its #1 pollinator is fungus beetles. So even though those beetles evolved to eat fungus, to eat mushrooms, this plant has kind of hijacked that relationship and said, hey, if you come over here, I've got some really tasty mushrooms for you. Haha, surprise, you just pollinated me. So it's this really unusual relationship because plants don't usually want to mimic fungus. A lot of people think of plants as being more evolved or more advanced than fungus. But in this case, looking like a fungus is the most successful strategy for these particular weird plants. So that brings us back to what I'm actually talking about today and why I'm doing research at Powdermill. So here's our stinky friend, Symplocarpus foetida, the eastern skunk cabbage. And I wanted to know what pollinates it. Like, is there a chance it could be beetles? The reason I think it might be beetles is because this is western skunk cabbage. Where I grew up near Seattle, this is the species of skunk cabbage that we had around out there. It smelled equally bad, but it's pollinated almost exclusively by these adorable beetles called Americanum. They're really exciting. They're a type of rove beetle that's considered sort of primitive or an early diverging lineage. They have a pair of little ocelli on the top of their head, which is how you can recognize them. And they are the only thing that pollinates this skunk cabbage. But when you look at the literature, when you look at the research that's been done on Symplocarpus, our local skunk cabbage, there's been some sort of lackadaisical approaches. Here's a paper from 1879 where the naturalists describe how on the first warm and sunny day we repaired to a sheltered swampy place where we found our plant, and then they sat around and watched some bugs come in, and a hive bee has appeared, and a scavenger beetle showed up. But I wouldn't describe this as a particularly rigorous attempt at collecting ecological data. There are a few subsequent papers that actually did a much better job of keeping an appendix of the actual species of insect that they found. Unfortunately, those papers were done by dipterists, people who study flies. And so they did a great job of identifying all the flies that they found, and they threw the beetles away because they were too hard to identify. So, my next question is, well, I bet there's beetles. They mentioned there were beetles. I want to know if there are beetles coming to visit and or pollinate our skunk cabbages here at Powdermill. Powdermill has a lot of beautiful, gross, swampy areas where there's lots of skunk cabbage growing. So I spent all of spring, January through March last year, coming out every couple of weeks to check sticky traps. This is a sticky trap that's used in agricultural research. You put it when you want to know what kind of insect pests are out in your crops or your fields. You can use it to sort of quantify how well a pest control treatment is working. I learned about these when I was working for the Australian government, studying pests of alfalfa. And so now I'm using those to try to figure out what beetles and other insects are coming to our local skunk cabbages here in western Pennsylvania. So I ran this all last season. Here's one of the little skunk cabbages poking up through the water. And then this season, I'm augmenting that with flight intercept traps. This is a kind of trap that we use only for beetles. It's great because unlike those sticky traps, which work great, you don't end up with a lot of flies in addition to your beetles. I don't want to identify flies any more than the fly people want to identify the beetles they caught. So the way this works, you can't quite see it, but if you see these 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of rope here, this is a square of mesh screen, like the kind you buy at the hardware store to put in your screen door. You can see one sort of from the side right here. You suspend that from the trees, and then underneath it, you put these pans that are full of a trap fluid that's a combination of water and diluted propylene glycol. So what happens is the beetles, who are terrible flyers universally, fly along, they hit that screen, that mesh screen, which you can see is almost invisible here. They hit it, they stop flying immediately, and they drop straight into those pans. And I come along once a week, and I empty out the pans, strain out the bugs, store them in ethanol, and then pour the trap fluid back into the pans. So nothing is getting poured onto the ground. We make sure that it's not getting disturbed or interfered with by wildlife. And you can see over here, the skunk cabbages, every one of these little shoots is a little baby skunk cabbage coming up. You have a question, sir?
What about how skunk cabbages heat up?
Yeah, they do heat up. They are thermogenic, so just like that dead horse lily. I don't know if I have a photo of that in here, but yeah, one of the great things about skunk cabbages, and I haven't shown it in this picture, but this is kind of wet and mushy and marshy and mucky. It gets cold here sometimes. Perhaps you noticed it, for us at least, it snowed a lot this morning. We can have cold snaps, and all of this is going to freeze solid. And you might say, well, that seems bad for the plants. I don't think plants like it when you freeze them completely and then thaw and then freeze and then thaw. In fact, that's a great way to completely ruin cells. When we're studying DNA, we don't want to freeze and thaw tissue. But if you're a thermogenic plant, like Symplocarpus, like our skunk cabbage, you make your own heat. And so you can burn your way up, literally. You melt the ice around you, you melt the snow around you. And it's really, I think there's something very inspiring about seeing skunk cabbage in the snow because it's cold, it's a wasteland looking winterscape, and then you see these brave little cabbages just burning through the snow, blazing hot, not actually that hot. There are some of the Titan arum and the dead horse lily can actually get up to about 100 degrees. So hotter than human body temperature. But these little guys stay well below human body temperature, but it's still a pretty cool place to hang out if you're a little bug, for example. And that's what keeps them from being damaged by all those cold snaps. They make their own heat, which is a really good trick if you're a plant, frankly. So that's how I want to catch these bugs and find out what we've got. It's kind of disgusting work. This is a picture I took last week sinking into the mud almost up to the top of my boots. I think maybe next year I'll invest in hip waders, but that's okay, that's how I like it. That's why I have the best job. I get to go out and stomp around in the mud looking for weird bugs and weird plants and get paid for it. So, well, some of the things we found so far from our traps that we ran last year, first of all, we got the same selection of flies, the same profile of fly families that the previously published carefully conducted research studies had found. So the pollinator studies done by Dipterus found the same set of flies that we had in the cabbage. I set supplementary sticky traps away from the cabbage patches to make sure I'm not just catching something that just happens to be flying around anyway. I'm only interested in the things that are coming to the cabbage on purpose. So this tells us that we're on the right track, that these are the species that we expect to see in skunk cabbage. We're capturing the insects that want to be there with the skunk cabbage. We've got O'Malley's staphylinens, different species from the one in the western skunk cabbage, but sure enough, there is an honest-to-goodness O'Malley's staphylinens coming to our skunk cabbage here. And to me, that's really, really exciting because no one had ever looked for that before. That's a new biological association that's never been recorded. We also have some of my most favorite beetle family, the Lyotidae or truffle beetles. This is the group I did my PhD on. You can tell they're superior because they're round and cute. And then a beetle that I wasn't expecting to find that showed up. This is the Skirtidae. So Skirtids are really unusual. They don't look like much. They're just kind of a little brown beetle. They've got long wiggly antennae. Their larvae also have long wiggly antennae. It's the only freshwater beetle larva you'll find that has long antennae like that. They're very distinctive. This is a family that's never been recorded from Powdermill before. So that's a whole new record for us. So that's really cool. But the thing that's wild about Skirtids is that they love Phytotelmata. This is one of my favorite vocabulary words. The single is phytotelma, the plural is phytotelmata, and that's an unnecessarily complicated word for hole in plant but got water in it. So phytotelmata, a really common place you would see them is in the tropics, in bromeliads. You may have seen nature documentaries where tiny little frogs are laying their eggs and having tadpoles in these little bromeliad pools. They can also occur in pitcher plants. The pitcher plant where that tree shrew was using as a toilet, that was technically a phytotelma. Here in the not tropics, the phytotelmata that are typically available to us are what's called tree holes. That's a hole in a tree where water collects. And this is a really special microhabitat. There are some mosquitoes and other insects that can only be found in tree holes. They're really neat and exciting, even though it might just look like a wet hole in a tree. But that's what skirted beetles like. That's their favorite habitat ever. That's where they want to hang out. That's where they want to lay their eggs, and that's where they want their larvae to grow up. Phytotelmata. Now, why would a phytotelmata loving insect show up in the skunk cabbage? Well, if you take a skunk cabbage plant, this is one where I've removed the inflorescence. So I've broken off the red spathe part, and you can see the leaves. The leaves are all curled up, and once the spathes wilt, the leaves are going to unfurl, and you'll see these big green cabbagey leaves that are the reason we call this plant skunk cabbage in the first place. But before those leaves unfurl, the bottom of this plant actually collects quite a bit of water. And we know the plant is thermogenic, it's making its own heat. So is it actually producing a little phytotelma, a little self-heated pool for baby skirted beetles to grow up in? This is another biological association that's never been researched. There is zero literature of anybody looking at the role of or presence of phytotelmata in skunk cabbage. This is a completely new avenue of investigation that no one has looked at before. So while I'm trying to solve the mystery of whether beetle pollinators could be visiting our skunk cabbage, we have unlocked a completely new mystery, which is that a phytotelmata? Is it attracting plants? Is it attracting insects? Are there insects who are developing in the base of that skunk cabbage? Right now we don't know. How would you test that? That's a really interesting question too. Do I go around with an eyedropper and try to pull the water out? I don't want to go around snapping every skunk cabbage open that I see, because we need the skunk cabbages to stay there and persist for the good of the environment. But that's a really interesting question, and think about that, and if you have any ideas, I would love to hear them as well. So the final mystery that popped up while I was trying to answer the one simple question of what beetles come to our eastern skunk cabbage is, we've collected beetles. I've definitely trapped beetles now. We know beetles are coming to eastern skunk cabbage. We know they're coming to western skunk cabbage, but I know this is going to make your monocle pop out with shock and amazement. There's a third cabbage. I was going to put in a little poster from The Third Man, the Orson Welles movie, and then I thought that would be too topical. Aurantium aquaticum. This is the third cabbage. The subfamily Oriontoideae. This is the group this is the skunk cabbage. All the skunk cabbages in the world belong to the Oriontoideae. There are only 3 genera in the world. Only 3. There's Lysichiton, western US, Symplocarpus, eastern US, and Aurantium, which we also get in the eastern US. So while some of these genera occur elsewhere in the world, like in Asia and Europe, we are so lucky because we here in the USA have all 3 of them. That is so cool. And this one is perhaps somehow even weirder than the other 2. So Aurantium has hardly any spathe at all. We talked about how the spathe is this big fleshy part that covers the spadix where the pollen lives. Aurantium just has its fully nude spadix just right out there, not really covered up at all. It loves to live in water, in ponds and lakes, and it's kind of like a coelacanth of plants. The coelacanth is that fish that everyone thought was extinct, and then some living ones were discovered in a market in Africa in, I think, the 1940s or so. So that was like an incredible discovery because we only knew it from fossils, and suddenly here's a live one. Well, there are more fossil species of Aurantium than there are alive species today. So it's what we call a living fossil. It's this weird, primitive, bizarre plant. And again, they have that very distinctive inflorescence. And no one has ever tried to figure out what pollinates it. We don't know. Don't know. Completely up for grabs project, because no one wants to sit around by a shallow acidic pond or lake and try to trap insects that come to it or put up a sticky trap or anything. So this is a map of data points from iNaturalist. Each of these little red dots is a record of Orontium aquatica. Here's Pittsburgh. Here's Ligonier. Here's Rector, Pennsylvania, on Weaver Mill Road right there. So somebody about 4 years ago made a record of Orontium aquaticum right here in our backyard. So this is very exciting to me. No one I've spoken to from Powdermill has mentioned that they've seen Orontium on the property, I don't think. We should check the acid mine site, the acid mine reclamation site, if they like acidic habitats. That should be great. But this is really exciting because we might have some right here, and that would give us a chance to document their pollinators for the first time ever known to science. So the homework that I'm assigning to all of you, congratulations, there's homework. Appreciate your stinky plant friends. They're weird, they smell bad, they're hot, but they're really special. They're a deeply ancient lineage, and they're totally fascinating. Encourage everyone to enjoy aroids. They're so weird. There's a few aroids that are really important to people. Taro, which is a big starchy root that's commonly eaten in the Pacific, is an aroid. But they're bizarre. They reject the paradigm of normal flower. They say, no, I will not smell good. No, I won't be pretty. I'm going to be big and weird and stinky and hot, and you're gonna like it. And I can respect that. And finally, if you have property around here, or you go for walks at Powdermill, when we get to about April or May, start keeping an eye out for these big, vaguely monocot leaves poking out of little ponds and swamps. They are highly hydrophobic. That means that water beads up when it sits on their surface, which is exactly what you want when you're a plant that is usually sitting around in wet habitats. When they don't have their flowers out, they look pretty nondescript. It just looks like this big, green, hydrophobic leaf. In fact, apparently one of the common names for these is never wets, because they're so hydrophobic. But yeah, so we won't see the flowers coming out until probably about May in this part of the world. But if you have these in your backyard, or you could cite them in Powdermill or other public areas, I would love to conduct some research on these guys. So if you would like to either support our research, participate in our research, or be a co-author on a scientific paper describing the pollinators of Orontium aquaticum for the first time in human history, then get at me. These are my contact details, and I will be keeping an eye out for these guys down on Weaver Mill Road and our Powdermill property. But right now, it's still Symplocarpus season. We still have our little purple skunk cabbages. But as those guys die down and their leaves come out, we're going to be looking for these Orontium leaves starting to show up, and they're weird little...
Does iNaturalist recognize it?
Yep. So then that weird little candle-like inflorescence will show up. So that's my call to action for today. So thank you so much for having me out here.